September 8, 1380. On a fog-shrouded field where the Don River bends through the Russian heartland, 150,000 men stand ready to kill each other. The fate of an entire civilization hangs in the balance. For over a century, the Mongol Empire and its successor state, the Golden Horde, have held the Russian principalities in an iron grip of terror and tribute. Cities burned, princes bowed. Entire generations grew up knowing nothing but subjugation. But on this cold autumn morning, everything is about to change. A secret weapon, hidden in the forest, waits to spring a trap that will shatter what was thought to be the most unstoppable military force the world had ever seen. This is the story of how a single tactical innovation and the desperate courage of outnumbered men broke the myth of Mongol invincibility forever. To understand what happened at Kulikovo, we must first understand what made the Mongols so terrifying. In 1237, the grandson of Genghis Khan, a commander named Batu, led a massive invasion force into the fractured lands of Kievan Rus. What followed was not merely conquest, it was annihilation on a scale that still haunts Russian memory. The Mongol Cavalry was unlike anything European or Russian forces had ever encountered. These were not knights in heavy armor, bound by codes of chivalry. These were masters of mobility, endurance, and psychological warfare. Each Mongol warrior rode with multiple horses, allowing them to cover impossible distances without rest. They could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy, while riding at full gallop, raining death on enemies who could barely see them through the dust and chaos. Their composite bows, made of wood, horn, and sinew, could pierce armor at 200 paces. But it was not just their weapons or their horsemanship that made them unstoppable. It was their discipline, their coordination, their ability to execute complex maneuvers as if guided by a single mind. Feigned retreats would draw enemy forces into ambushes. Flanking movements would appear from nowhere. By the time their opponents realized what was happening, it was already too late. One survivor of the Mongol invasion of Ryazan, in 1237, wrote these words: "They came like a flood of iron and fire. Our walls meant nothing. Our courage meant nothing. Within 5 days the city was ash, and those who survived wished they had died with honor in the first assault." Ryazan was just the beginning. Vladimir, Suzdal, Moscow, Kozelsk, city after city fell. Princes who resisted were executed with brutal creativity. Those who submitted paid crushing tribute. By 1240, the invasion was complete. The Mongols had conquered more Russian territory in 3 years than the Roman legions had conquered in a century of campaigning. But the Mongols did not stay to rule directly. Instead, they established what became known as the Mongol yoke. They traveled to the Mongol capital at Sarai, on the lower Volga, to receive patents of authority called yarliks. They paid tribute in silver, furs, and slaves. Most importantly, they were forbidden to unite. The Mongols understood that a divided Rus posed no threat. A united Rus could be dangerous. For over a century, this system worked perfectly. The Golden Horde grew wealthy on Russian tribute. The princes competed against each other for Mongol favor. But by the 1370s, something had begun to shift. The Golden Horde itself was fracturing. The death of Khan Berdebek in 1359 had triggered a period of chaos known as the Great Troubles. In just 20 years, more than 20 different Khans claimed the throne. Civil war raged across the steppe. And in this chaos, one man saw an opportunity. His name was Dmitry Ivanovich, Prince of Moscow. Later, history would call him Dmitry Donskoy, Dmitry of the Don, for what he was about to accomplish. Dmitry was only 9 years old when he became prince in 1359. He grew up watching Moscow's power expand while the horde tore itself apart. He was not content to be a vassal. He had been raised on stories of the great princes of Kiev, of Alexander Nevsky, of a time when Russians controlled their own destiny. By 1375, Dmitry had done something no Russian prince had managed since the conquest. He had unified the major principalities of northeastern Rus under Moscow's leadership. Vladimir, Suzdal, Rostov, even the merchant republic of Novgorod sent their support. This was unprecedented, this was dangerous, and the horde noticed. In 1376, a Mongol general named Mamai seized control of the western portion of the Golden Horde. Mamai was not a descendant of Genghis Khan, which meant he could never claim the title of Khan himself. Instead, he ruled through puppet Khans, holding real power while maintaining the fiction of legitimacy. He was a brilliant administrator and a ruthless military commander, and he understood that Dmitry's growing independence represented an existential threat to Mongol authority. If Moscow refused to pay tribute and got away with it, every other vassal state would follow. The entire system would collapse. In 1378, Mamai sent a punitive expedition under Mirza Begich to remind Dmitry of his place. It was a standard tactic, a swift raid, some burned villages, maybe the sack of a small town. The prince would see sense, pay his back tribute with interest, and order would be restored. Except that is not what happened. Dmitry met Begich's force on the Vozhya River with an army of Moscow's best troops. What followed shocked everyone. The Russian heavy cavalry, fighting in tight formation, smashed through the Mongol forces. Begich himself was killed. His army fled in disorder. For the first time in over a century, Russian forces had defeated a Mongol army in open battle. One of Dmitry's commanders later recalled the moment. We had always been told the Mongols were demons on horseback, that to face them was to face death itself. But when their arrows bounced off our armor, when our lances drove them from their saddles, when they turned and ran instead of fighting to the last man, I realized something. They were just men. Dangerous men, yes. Skilled warriors, absolutely. But men, and men can be defeated. Mamai could not let this stand. He gathered his forces, hired mercenary heavy cavalry from the Genoese colonies on the Black Sea, formed an alliance with Prince Jogaila of Lithuania, who also saw Dmitry as a threat, and prepared to lead the largest Mongol invasion force since Batu's conquest. The sources vary on the exact numbers, but most historians estimate Mamai commanded somewhere between 90,000 and 150,000 warriors. This included his Mongol cavalry, Alan and Circassian auxiliaries from the Caucasus, the Genoese heavy cavalry, and Jogaila's Lithuanian forces. Against this, Dmitry could field perhaps 50 to 70,000 men from the united Russian principalities. He was outnumbered. He was facing the most sophisticated military machine in the world. And he knew that if he lost, Moscow would burn and the dream of Russian independence would die for generations. But Dmitry had something Mamai did not expect. He had studied the Mongol way of war. He had learned from his victory at Vozhya. And he had a plan that depended on terrain, timing, and a weapon the Mongols would never see coming until it was far too late. The place he chose to make his stand was a broad field near the confluence of the Don and Nepriadva rivers, a place that would become known as Kulikovo Field. The choice of battlefield was everything. Dmitry needed ground that would neutralize the Mongols' greatest advantage, their mobility and their ability to execute sweeping flanking maneuvers. Kulikovo Field was perfect. It was bounded by forests on both sides and by rivers at the back. The Mongols would have to attack frontally, straight into the teeth of the Russian line. They could not sweep around the flanks. They could not retreat and regroup without exposing themselves to pursuit. In late August 1380, Dmitry began marching south from Moscow. His army was a coalition force unlike anything seen in over a century. There were the elite boyar cavalry from Moscow, warriors who had trained their entire lives for battle, their horses caparisoned in steel and leather, their lances tipped with the finest iron. There were infantry levies from dozens of towns and villages, men with spears and axes, with leather armor and wooden shields. There were contingents from Suzdal, from Vladimir, from Rostov, from as far away as Pskov and Bryansk. Orthodox monks marched with the army. The Trinity Monastery's abbot, Sergius of Radonesh, the most revered holy man in all of Rus, had blessed Dmitry's campaign. Two monks, Peresvet and Osliabia, former warriors before they took their vows, rode with the prince as spiritual champions. The march south took 2 weeks. It was early September, and already the nights were growing cold. The men knew what was coming. Many of them would not return. Prayers were said in every camp. Letters were written to wives and children. Wills were made. One soldier from Kolomna wrote to his wife, "If God wills that I do not return, remember me not as a warrior but as a husband. Tell our son that his father fought so that he might grow up free, so that no Mongol master could come to our door demanding tribute, so that no foreign hand would rule our land. That is worth any price." On September 6th, the army reached the Don River. Here, Dmitry made a decision that would become legendary. He ordered his entire army to cross the river, putting it at their backs. There could be no retreat now. They would win, or they would die on Kulikovo Field. The message was clear to every man. This was not a raid. This was not a punitive expedition. This was a battle for the future of the Russian lands. Some of the princes protested. On September 7th, the army deployed on Kulikovo Field. Dmitry organized his forces in a traditional Russian manner, but with crucial modifications. The center was held by the Great Regiment, a massive formation of both cavalry and infantry, commanded by Dmitry himself in the early stages of the battle. This was the anvil. Flanking the Great Regiment on either side were the regiments of the right hand and left hand, strong defensive formations designed to hold against the inevitable Mongol attempts to envelope the center. Behind the main line was the reserve regiment, fresh troops held back for the critical moment when the battle hung in the balance. But the truly innovative element was hidden in the forest to the left of the Russian position. There, concealed in the woods, was the ambush regiment, commanded by Prince Vladimir of Serpukhov and the experienced General Dmitry Bobrok. This force consisted of the finest heavy cavalry Dmitry could muster, approximately 10 to 15,000 elite horsemen. Their horses were covered with the best armor available. Their riders wore mail and plate, carried steel-tipped lances, and had been drilled endlessly on what they would need to do. They were ordered to remain absolutely silent, to stay hidden no matter what happened on the field, to wait for the signal. This was the secret weapon. This was the hammer that would crush the Mongol cavalry. The concept was not entirely original. The Mongols themselves used ambush tactics constantly. But using heavy cavalry in a massed charge from ambush against an enemy's exposed flank at the critical moment of exhaustion was something different. Russian cavalry had traditionally been lighter, designed for skirmishing and pursuit, but Dmitry had invested heavily in equipment and training to create a force capable of delivering a devastating shock charge. The question was whether they could remain hidden long enough, and whether they could strike at precisely the right moment. Too early, and the Mongols would still have the strength to counter. Too late, and the Russian main line would collapse. The night before the battle, the fog was so thick that men standing 10 paces apart could barely see each other. The dampness seeped into everything. Fires were kept small to avoid revealing positions. In the Russian camp, priests moved among the soldiers, hearing confessions, offering communion. Dmitry himself spent hours in prayer. One chronicle records his words, "Lord, if we die tomorrow, let it be with honor, facing our enemies, fighting for our people. Let the world remember that we did not bow. Let our children know that we stood." Across the field, in the Mongol camp, Mamai held council with his commanders. He was confident. His forces outnumbered the Russians. His cavalry were the finest in the world. He had heavy mercenary cavalry from Genoa to break through any infantry line. Jogaila's Lithuanians were supposedly just a day's march away. All he needed to do was fix the Russian army in place, grind them down with arrow fire, then unleash his cavalry to envelope and destroy them. It was the same tactic that had worked for 140 years. There was no reason to believe it would not work again. But Mamai made a critical miscalculation. He assumed the Russians would fight the way they always had, defensively, waiting to be destroyed. He did not account for innovation. He did not account for desperation. and he did not account for the ambush regiment waiting in the forest. September 8th, 1380. Dawn broke over Kulikovo Field, with the fog slowly beginning to lift. The two armies could see each other now. Dark masses spread across the plain, banners hanging in the still air. The silence was profound. 150,000 men, waiting for the signal that would begin the slaughter. Then, according to the chronicles, something extraordinary happened. From the Russian lines, a single rider emerged. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, wearing the black robes of a monk. His name was Alexander Peresvet, one of the warrior monks blessed by Sergius of Radonish. From the Mongol lines, a champion rode out to meet him. His name is given in the sources as Chelubey or Temir Murza, a giant warrior known across the steppe for having never been defeated in single combat. This was an ancient tradition, a duel before the battle to decide which side had heaven's favor. The two warriors rode at each other with lances leveled. The entire field watched in absolute silence. The distance closed. 50 paces, 30, 10. The impact was tremendous. Both lances struck home. Peresvet's lance drove clean through Chelubey's armor, lifting him from his saddle and hurling him to the ground, dead before he hit the earth. But Chelubey's lance had also struck true, driving deep into Peresvet's chest. The monk swayed in his saddle but somehow remained mounted, slowly riding back toward the Russian lines before finally collapsing. Dead, but victorious. A roar went up from the Russian army. Their champion had won. God was with them. Morale, already high, became something more. Something fierce and unbreakable. And then the Mongol drums began to beat. The entire Mongol line surged forward. The battle had begun. The Mongol attack opened as it always did, with waves of horse archers. Thousands of riders swept forward, unleashing arrows at extreme range before wheeling away, the classic Parthian shot that had broken so many armies. The arrows fell like rain on the Russian formations. Men screamed as shafts found gaps in armor. Shields bristled with arrows. But the line held. Dmitry had prepared his troops for this. They knew the arrow storm was meant to break their nerve, to cause them to charge forward out of formation where the Mongol cavalry could destroy them piecemeal. The Russian commanders shouted orders. Hold, stay in formation, let them waste their arrows. And the line held. After perhaps an hour of this, Mamai committed his heavy cavalry. The Genoese mercenaries, knights in full plate armor on armored destriers, thundered toward the Russian center. Behind them came the Mongol cavalry proper, not in a wild charge but in controlled waves, designed to maintain constant pressure. The impact on the Russian center was catastrophic. The sound of the collision could be heard miles away, steel on steel, screams of men and horses. The great regiment buckled under the assault. Dmitry himself fought in the front ranks. Multiple sources confirm he was wounded during this phase of the battle, taking blows to his armor that dented the steel and left him bruised and bleeding. His royal armor made him a target, and at some point he was forced to exchange it with a junior boyar to survive. The boyar wearing Dmitry's armor was killed, and for hours during the battle, many believed the prince had fallen. The chaos was total. Men fought in heaving masses, unable to see more than a few feet in any direction through the dust and blood. This was not the elegant warfare of chronicles and songs. This was butchery. Men stabbed and hacked at each other. Horses screamed and kicked. The wounded were trampled by their own side. One veteran later described it simply: hell is not fire, hell is mud and blood and the weight of dead men pressing down on you as you try to stand. The Russian center was being pushed back. The regiments of the right hand and left hand were also under tremendous pressure as Mongol cavalry tried to envelope the flanks. Everywhere, the Russian line was bending. Mamai could see victory. Just a little more pressure, just a few more charges. The enemy would break, and then the slaughter could begin in earnest. But he did not know about the ambush regiment. Hidden in the forest, Prince Vladimir of Serpukhov and General Dmitry Bobrok watched the battle with agonizing patience. Their men were fresh, their horses were rested. They could hear the screams and the clash of steel. They could see the clouds of dust rising over the field, and they had to wait. Bobrok was an experienced commander, possibly the most experienced in the Russian army. He understood timing. He watched the Mongol formations as they committed more and more troops to breaking the Russian center. He watched as their reserve units were pulled forward. He watched as discipline began to fray at the edges, as individual units pursued advantages, as gaps appeared in the Mongol line. And then he saw it. The moment. The Mongol left flank, the cavalry that had been pushing against the Russian right-hand regiment, was exhausted. They were still fighting, but their horses were blown, their formations were loose. They were fully committed. They had no reserve, and their entire flank was exposed to the forest. Bobrok gave the signal. From the forest, 15,000 heavy cavalrymen erupted in a massive wedge formation. The Mongols never saw them coming. The impact was devastating. Russian lances drove into the exposed flank of the Mongol cavalry. Men were lifted from their saddles. Entire formations disintegrated. The sheer weight and momentum of the charge was irresistible. This was not a skirmish. This was an avalanche of steel and horseflesh crashing into an unprepared enemy. The Mongol left flank did not just break. It ceased to exist as a fighting force. But the ambush regiment did not stop. Bobrok kept his forces together, wheeling them from the flank charge into a sweep across the entire Mongol rear. Supply trains were overrun. Command posts were scattered. Suddenly, the Mongols were not attacking. They were being attacked from behind. Panic, the great killer of armies, began to spread. The Russian center, which had been on the verge of collapse, felt the pressure ease. Fresh troops from the reserve regiment moved forward, and now it was the Russians who attacked. The great regiment, which had been defending desperately for hours, surged forward. The right and left-hand regiments pushed their opponents back, and the ambush regiment continued its devastating charge across the Mongol rear. Mamai tried to rally his forces. He committed his personal guard. He sent orders to regroup and face the new threat. But it was too late. The psychology of the battle had shifted. For a century and a half, Mongol cavalry had been the ones who sprang ambushes, who attacked from unexpected directions, who used superior mobility to destroy their enemies. Now it was happening to them. The iron discipline that made the Mongol army so effective required confidence in their commanders and their tactics. That confidence was shattered. What began as an organized withdrawal became a rout. Units fled individually, each trying to escape the trap. The Russian cavalry pursued them mercilessly. The battle became a slaughter. Contemporary sources suggest the fighting lasted from mid-morning until late afternoon, perhaps 8 to 10 hours of continuous combat. By the time the sun began to set, Kulikovo Field was a charnel house. Bodies were piled so thick in places that the ground could not be seen. The rivers ran red. The chronicles say that over 100,000 men died that day, though modern historians think the number was probably lower, perhaps 40 to 60,000, which was still one of the bloodiest single-day battles in medieval history. Mamai himself escaped with a remnant of his army, perhaps a few thousand riders. His political career was over. He fled to the Crimea, where he was later murdered by rivals. The Golden Horde's aura of invincibility was broken. But the cost to the Russians was also terrible. Half of Dmitry's army was dead or wounded. Entire towns lost all their men of fighting age. The chronicles list the noble dead, page after page of names. Families that had existed for centuries ended on Kulikovo Field. Dmitry himself was found after the battle unconscious under a pile of bodies, his armor battered almost beyond recognition. He survived, but he was never the same. The wounds he took that day would trouble him for the rest of his life. In the days after the battle, the work of burying the dead took over a week. Mass graves were dug. Priests spoke prayers over thousands of bodies at once. Many of the dead were never identified, their bodies too mutilated, their belongings lost in the chaos. One widow wrote in a letter that survived to our time, "I do not know if my husband lies in one of the graves, or if his body still rests somewhere on that field. They told me he was last seen fighting near the center, that he fought bravely. That is all I have now, a story of bravery and an empty place at my table." So what was the secret weapon that destroyed the Mongol cavalry? It was not a piece of technology. It was not a new invention. It was a tactical innovation, the use of heavy cavalry held in ambush and released at the perfect moment against an exposed flank. But more than that, it was a change in mentality. For over a century, Russian princes had fought the Mongols the way victims fight their oppressors, defensively, hoping to survive rather than expecting to win. Dmitry and his commanders fought the way conquerors fight, aggressively, using terrain and deception, willing to risk everything on a bold plan. They studied their enemy, identified weaknesses in tactics that were considered perfect, and exploited those weaknesses with precision and courage. The ambush regiment worked because it was unexpected. The Mongols had faced hidden troops before, but never heavy cavalry in such numbers, never at exactly the moment when their own forces were fully committed and exhausted. Bobrock's patience in waiting for the right moment was crucial. An hour earlier, and the Mongol reserves would have countered the charge. An hour later, and the Russian center would have collapsed. The timing had to be perfect, and it was. This required not just planning, but incredible discipline. The men in the ambush regiment had to remain hidden, while their comrades died just hundreds of yards away. They had to trust their commanders completely, and when the moment came, they had to execute a complex maneuver, maintaining formation during a flanking charge, then wheeling to attack the rear, all while in the chaos of battle. It was a masterpiece of military coordination. The weapons themselves were not revolutionary. Russian heavy cavalry used lances, swords, maces, and war axes. Their horses wore armor of leather and steel plates. The riders wore mail hauberks covered with plate cuirasses. It was equipment similar to what Western European knights used, and indeed, some Russian nobles had trained with or against European knights and adopted their tactics. The key was the weight and momentum. A mass charge of heavy cavalry was like a battering ram. If it hit a prepared infantry formation with pikes, it would fail disastrously. But if it hit light cavalry from the flank, cavalry that was already exhausted and not in formation, it was unstoppable. The Mongol cavalry, for all their skill, were not equipped to fight toe-to-toe against heavy cavalry in a melee. Their advantage was mobility and archery. They wore lighter armor to keep their horses fresh during long campaigns. Their tactics relied on space to maneuver. At Kulikovo, Dmitry denied them that space. The field was bounded by forests and rivers. The Mongols had to attack frontally. And when the ambush regiment appeared on their flank, they had nowhere to go. They could not outrun the charge. They could not shoot their way out of a melee, and they could not maintain their discipline under attack from an unexpected direction. But we should not reduce the battle to simple mechanics. The reason Kulikovo Field became legendary was not just because of the tactics. It was because of what it meant. For the first time in living memory, the Russians had proven they could defeat the Mongols in a major battle. The tribute system did not end immediately. The Golden Horde continued to exist, continued to demand payments, continued to raid Russian territory. But the psychological balance had shifted. Russian princes had seen that the Mongols could be beaten. The next generation would push further. In 1480, just a century after Kulikovo, Ivan III would formally end tribute payments and declare Russian independence. The so-called Mongol yoke was over. Kulikovo Field was the beginning of that end. Dmitry Donskoy became a hero in Russian memory, not because he defeated the Mongols forever in a single battle, but because he showed it could be done. The warrior monks Peresvet and Osliabaya became saints. The battle itself became a foundational myth in Russian national identity, a moment when courage and faith defeated overwhelming odds. Icons were painted showing Dmitry praying before the battle, Peresvet's duel with Chelubey, the charge of the ambush regiment. Songs were sung, chronicles were written and rewritten, each adding layers of legend to the historical core. Modern historians debate the details. How many men actually fought? How decisive was the victory really? Did Jogaila's Lithuanians actually participate, or did they arrive late and then withdraw? Was the death toll really as high as the chronicles claim? These are important questions, and the truth is we do not know for certain. Medieval sources are notoriously unreliable when it comes to numbers. They exaggerate for effect. They reflect the biases of their authors. But what is not in doubt is that a major battle was fought, that the Russians won a significant victory, and that this victory had profound psychological and political consequences. The secret weapon was not just the ambush regiment. It was the willingness to believe that victory was possible. It was the unity of the Russian principalities under Moscow's leadership. It was the strategic choice of battlefield that negated the Mongol advantages. It was the discipline to execute a complex plan under the worst possible conditions. It was the courage to cross the Don River and make retreat impossible. It was all of these things together. War is never about one factor. It is about the combination of leadership, training, morale, equipment, terrain, timing, and luck. At Kulikovo Field, for one afternoon in September 1380, all of those factors aligned in Russia's favor. Dmitry Donskoy died in 1389, just 9 years after his great victory. He was only 38 years old. The wounds he had taken at Kulikovo and the stress of constant warfare against the horde and rival princes had worn him down. But he lived long enough to see his son, Vasily, recognized as his successor without needing Mongol approval, a small but significant step toward independence. His funeral was attended by thousands. The chroniclers wrote that all of Moscow wept. He was buried in the Archangel Cathedral in the Kremlin, where his tomb remains to this day. The legacy of Kulikovo Field lives on. In Russia, September 8th is celebrated as a day of military glory. Monuments stand on the battlefield. Museums preserve artifacts, arrowheads and sword fragments, pieces of armor dug from the earth where they fell over 6 centuries ago. Reenactors gather to commemorate the battle. Historians continue to study it, to argue about it, to try to understand exactly what happened on that fog-shrouded field. Because Kulikovo Field matters. It matters as a turning point in Russian history. It matters as an example of how a supposedly invincible force can be defeated through innovation and courage. It matters as a human story of men who faced impossible odds and chose to fight rather than submit. When we talk about secret weapons, we often think of technological breakthroughs. Gunpowder, the longbow, Greek fire. But sometimes the most powerful weapon is not an object but an idea. The idea that defeat is not inevitable. The idea that careful planning can overcome raw strength. The idea that unity and purpose can triumph over division and fear. That was the real secret weapon that destroyed the Mongol Cavalry at Kulikovo Field. Not the ambush itself, but the determination and intelligence that made the ambush possible. The willingness to learn from the enemy, to adapt, to take risks, to believe in victory, even when history said victory was impossible. Kulikovo Field was not the end of the Mongol threat. There would be more battles, more invasions, more years of tribute and suffering. But it was the beginning of the end. It was the moment when the balance of power began to shift. Slowly, painfully, over the course of a century, but irreversibly. The men who died there bought that future with their blood. The commanders who planned the battle, who held their nerve during hours of desperate fighting, who waited for exactly the right moment to spring their trap, they changed the course of history. And the secret weapon they wielded was not just steel and horseflesh. It was hope. It was the refusal to accept that things had to stay as they always had been. It was the courage to imagine a different future and the skill and determination to make that future real. That is the story of Kulikovo Field. Not just a battle, but a transformation. Not just a victory, but a declaration. The age of Mongol dominance was ending. The age of Russian independence was beginning, and it all came down to one desperate gamble on a cold September morning. A secret weapon hidden in a forest, and the men brave enough to use it. This is how empires fall. Not always in a single moment, but in moments like this one, when the impossible becomes possible, when the myth of invincibility shatters, when courage and cleverness combine to change the world. Kulikovo Field. September 8, 1380. The day the Mongol cavalry was destroyed. The day Russia began to rise.